So, like I said, this lawsuit was filed against Diddy by Don Richard. It was filed on September 10th, 2024, and there's a host of entities that are named as defendants. So, the real people that we have named in this one is Sean Combs and Harve Pierre, and there are a host of entities that are also named in this complaint, which are associated with Diddy, Bad Boy, and Universal Music Group. So we can just scroll down here. We'll also note that at the very end, there's Doe corporations and also Doe defendants. So what that means is there are other entities that are not named in this complaint that might be discovered at some point in this litigation. And so Ms. Richard and her attorneys are reserving the right to add those additional defendants once that information is learned. So if there are additional corporations or additional individual entities, they will be later named. So that's why we have the Doe corporations and the Doe defendants. So this is just the preamble. Ms. Richard, by and through her attorneys, bring this lawsuit against all of these defendants. So Ms. Richard alleges this information concerning her own experience based upon her personal knowledge and upon information and belief as to all other matters. So this phrase, information and belief, is a phrase that us lawyers use. It's saying, like, to the best of our knowledge, but that this is what exactly happened, but we may not have personal knowledge that this in fact happened. So first page, we have a preliminary statement. This is really just providing us some background about who Don Richard is. She is a singer, she is a musician, she is a songwriter, and she is best known for being a member of the girl group Danity Kane, which was formed as a part of Diddy's Making the Band series that was featured on MTV. And she also was a member of the group Diddy Dirty Money that was Diddy, Kalina, and Don Richard. And they had an album, The Last Train to Paris. So this is giving us a little bit of background about who Miss Richard is. Paragraph 2 is a little bit of background about who Diddy is. But at this point, I think we all know who Diddy is. Interestingly, they're looking at this second page, this second sentence. It says, in 1998, Mr. Combs explained the origins of his stage name in a USA Today interview. His nickname was Puff because he had a temper and was known to huff and puff when he was angry. So this is an interesting fact. I'm assuming that the attorneys found this interview and have this information, which is why they included it in this article. And, you know, if we put our thinking hats on, it's like Mrs. Richard's attorneys are trying to paint a very specific image of who Mr. Combs is. And so they're using this article, they're using his own words, saying, you know, Puff is because he liked to huff and puff. So let's move to paragraph 3, more information about Mr. Combs. Over the decades following his rise to fame, Mr. Combs' star-studded, larger-than-life persona overshadowed his vicious temper and pervasive acts of violence directed towards those in his inner circle, specifically women. So let's just keep that in our minds, that, you know, this lawsuit is trying to frame Mr. Combs and his temper and his treatment specifically to women. Now, I have looked over this complaint, and so I know that one of the causes of action that are alleged in this complaint is related to the violation of a statute that about violence against women. So I think that may be why this sentence was included in the complaint. Moving to paragraph 4, Mr. Combs' namesake temper frequently manifested in physical violence. Mr. Combs regularly hurled objects in fits of rage, often throwing items such as mobile phones, laptops, food, and studio equipment across the room or at people. On numerous occasions, Mrs. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs brutally beat his girlfriend, Miss Cassandra Cassie Ventura, Miss Ventura. His persistent abuse included choking and strangling Miss Ventura, striking her with his hands and with objects, slapping her, punching her, and throwing items at her, including a scalding hot pan. Now, this paragraph 4, is another characterization of Diddy, and based upon, I believe this is information and belief, trying to paint the picture of Mr. Combs' history of violence against women. And what's interesting about this specifically, I would imagine there are some allegations that are listed here that may have also been included in the lawsuit that Miss Ventura filed against Mr. Combs back in November of 2023. And I know, more recently, earlier this year, there was a video that was released, hotel footage of Mr. Combs assaulting Miss Ventura, an act to which he later apologized for on his social media sites. So, going back to paragraph 3 and paragraph 4, we're looking at, Mr. Combs is being framed as someone who has a temper, he has violence against women, he was abusive towards his girlfriend, and, the public has a specific image of Mr. Combs after seeing that footage of him assaulting Miss Ventura in that hotel. So I think this is, I believe this paragraph is to go toward that specific imaging of who Mr. Combs is. So let's keep reading. On many occasions, Miss Richard tried to intervene, offering Miss Ventura support and encouragement to leave Mr. Combs. Each time, Mr. Combs learned of her efforts to help Miss Ventura and became enraged, threatening Mrs. Richard's life with statements such as, "You want to die today? I make ninjas go missing and I end people." Wow, let's continue reading. Paragraph 6. Compounding Mr. Combs' violent acts and threats, he flagrantly exploited Mrs. Richard's musical talent as a singer and writer while withholding her rightful earnings, stealing her copyrighted works, and subjecting her to years of inhumane working conditions, which included groping, assault, and false imprisonment, among other violations. So just as a precursor, paragraph 6, it's indicating that Mrs. Richard's claims kind of run the scope. Likely, number 1, withholding her rightful earnings. So this is kind of getting toward the employment relationship between Miss Richard, Mr. Combs, and a lot of the other entities to which he worked for and with her being the employee, and them and these entities, these other defendants, being the employers, saying, hey, listen, in addition to all of these acts which I'm alleging, groping, assault, imprisonment, there was also some money that was owed to me that was not paid. On top of that, there were some copywriting works that were stolen. So I imagine that she's going to be seeking compensation for all of these issues in her lawsuit. And that's a really smart idea by Mrs. Richard and her attorneys, that approach of, positioning Mr. Combs and these entities that he works for and with as her employers because of her membership in Danity Kane and also in the Dirty Money group. She is an employee, and that the law entitles her to certain protections as an employee, and as her employer, they have certain obligations towards her. And so highlighting this relationship, including claims related to that relationship, is a really smart idea by her attorneys. If instead of taking this case to trial, they want to try to leverage a settlement, including all of these grievances in it, likely will prove helpful to her and her attorneys as a strategy for resolving this case without having to see it all the way through to a jury. So let's move to paragraph 7. For nearly a decade, Mr. Combs manipulated Miss Richard with mantras that submission to his depraved demands were necessary for career advancement, instilling in her the belief that such abuse and exploitation were required for female artists to succeed in the music industry. It was not until Miss Ventura's bravery in coming forward that Miss Richard realized her own personal suffering was tied to the many years of abuse by Mr. Combs that had become normalized for her. Now, I do want to kind of take an aside based upon what's in this paragraph. So when the news broke that Miss Richard had filed this lawsuit, I got on the internet, looked at a few articles, and was reading some comments about the filing of this lawsuit. And what was really curious to me were comments saying, Miss Richard worked with him for all this time. This is a money grab. If his treatment of her was so bad, she would not have returned to work with him with Danity Kane, with Diddy Dirty Money. I think there's also some information out there that she might have worked with him on his latest album, the Love album. And so what I think we should really caution against is saying that because a person is alleging that they were the victims of suffering by their employer, by their significant other, etc., and despite that treatment, they remained in the relationship, in the dynamic, that is somehow minimizes what they went through, and it means that what they are alleging happened did not in fact occur. Because both things can be true, right? It can be true that, number one, you suffered some horrible personal outcomes as a result of a dynamic of a workplace, a romantic relationship, a platonic relationship, etc. And you could remain in those relationships. You can continue those relationships even in spite of that treatment. And it doesn't mean that you acquiesced or you said it was okay for someone to treat you that way or for a job to treat you that way. Those things are not mutually exclusive. So I think we should just caution ourselves by saying that because somebody suffered or alleges that they've suffered some kind of trauma and they remained after this trauma occurred, it means that this did not happen and they've asked for whatever happened, right? Because both of those things are not necessarily true. So let's move on to paragraph 8. As more women courageously come forward, plaintiff has been empowered by this collective strength and now adds her voice to the growing chorus of victims bravely sharing their harrowing stories. Together, they seek justice and stand in solidarity as the latest victims of the Me Too movement in the music industry. So this is a very, very great paragraph. So what I want to do is kind of breeze through the next paragraph are the parties. So it just kind of outlines the individual parties, what states they are residents of, and tries to give an overview of how they are, connected to the claims in the lawsuit. So we have, Miss Richard and each individual entity. Now, what we will note as I kind of breeze through this is that, for each of these defendants, Mrs. Richard's attorneys are highlighting that these individuals meet the definition of an employer under the legal statutes. And why that I believe is potentially important is based upon what specific statutes that she's seeking relief under in this lawsuit. The dynamic of her being an employee and these entities being her employer will entitle her to some additional causes of action and additional protections under the law. So that's likely why these allegations are here. So we'll just scroll through. Harve Pierre, I know, is associated as, at one point he was the president of Bad Boy Records. There we go. President of Bad Boy Entertainment and Bad Boy Records. All right, so looking at paragraph 22, just want to highlight this is about defendant Universal Music Group. I want to call your attention to the last sentence. At all relevant times herein, UMG and subsidiaries Interscope, Geffen, A&M Records financially benefited from, condoned, and enabled defendants Combs' misconduct as defined under all relevant statutes. So I imagine this is attempting to get at, these entities and trying to invoke their liability for potentially knowing what type of conduct Mr. Combs is alleged to have engaged in, and what duties they may have as an entity that knew of these acts, did condone them and enabled them and allowed them to continue. So that's a pretty interesting fact. Let's keep going. We have Diago, aka Ciroc. This is just about jurisdiction and venue. So jurisdiction is about where the case will be heard. This is a federal case, and so this kind of explains the law regarding what kind of cases can be heard in a federal court, and venue is about what specific courthouse location the case will be heard in. So let's move to the factual allegation section. So, paragraph 1, Miss Richard is selected to be in Mr. Combs' all-female musical group, Danity Kane, after competing on MTV's Making the Band. This is, Miss Richard is right here just kind of relaying her participation in Making the Band, which aired in 2005. And then she was also involved in season 5 of Making the Band, which aired in 2009. So I think, by way of background, this particular factual allegation is trying to really outline how important to Miss Richard her musical career was, and how the opportunity to be a part of the group Danity Kane was to her. I think that to my kind of rant a little bit earlier, when people question, okay, if you saw this type of conduct, if you suffered conduct at the hands of a certain individual, why would a person continue subjecting themselves to that situation? And I think this first factual section outlining her journey in the group Danity Kane and being on the show Making the Band is the answer to that question, right? She is a musician, she's a songwriter, she is a singer, and for her, this opportunity, something that meant a lot to her, and it was very special to her because of the notoriety of Mr. Combs, and because of the opportunity that would be available to her by being in a girl group, realizing her dream. So I think they're trying to provide some background as to why Miss Richard would appreciate the opportunities offered to her by participating in Making the Band, participating in the group Danity Kane, and participating in the group Dirty Money, because of her aspirations as a singer and actress. Okay, So paragraph 36, upon information and belief to create Making the Band, camera crews filmed 24 hours a day, gathering months worth of footage to condense into mere hours of entertainment for viewers. I think this is trying to help to establish what she considered to be the standard working conditions in the industry. Based upon this experience with Making the Band and Danity Kane, this is what she's establishing as, I believe that this conduct, or I believe having to work 24 hours, being on call, right, always having to be filmed and recorded, is a part of what comes with being in a female girl group. So I think that's what she's trying to get at here. So paragraph 38, Danity Kane's first album sold over 4 million copies. Damages to Miss Richard for unpaid salaries are estimated at $1 million. Danity Kane's Welcome to the Dollhouse sold over 2 million copies, and damages to Miss Richard for unpaid salaries and royalties are estimated at $500,000. Damages on unpaid wages for touring on over 100 dates for Miss Richard with Danity Kane are estimated at $1.8 million. So, going back to my comment earlier, that her including as defendants these entities associated with the music labels, the production companies, the recording companies, etc., associated with Bad Boy and Universal. A part of the reason why they may be included in this lawsuit is so that she can levy these allegations about unpaid wages, unpaid royalties, etc. Now the question will be, Danity Kane, their albums came out in 2006 and 2008. So 2006, that was 18 years ago. 2008, that was 2008, that was 16 years ago. So that's some time. So there will be a question of, are the defendants liable to Miss Richard for these damages under the relevant statute of limitations? Now, we don't know how she's calculating how much she's owed, etc., but there will be a question of, is it past the statute of limitations for her to recoup these monies from defendant that she's alleging is owed? Because the law sets a limit on how old something can be before you can bring a lawsuit about it, right? So we don't want so much time to pass that memories fade, that documents are unavailable. So we want to limit, right, the amount of time a person has to bring a lawsuit to make sure that we have, the best information, the best means to prove it. So these claims may be subject to some statute of limitations, just simply based upon when these albums were released. So 39 just talks about the end of Danity Kane. So section 2, Miss Richard's first encounters Mr. Combs' aggressive, intimidating behavior and animus toward women. So there we see again that language about Mr. Combs allegedly aiming this specific behavior toward women specifically. So, paragraph 41. During auditions, Mr. Combs spoke to the female contestants in a hostile, condescending manner, making disparaging gender-based remarks such as calling them fat, ugly, B-word, H-word. Miss Richard felt threatened and intimidated by Mr. Combs' blatant disdain for the young women like herself who were excited for the opportunity to be on his show. So again, we're highlighting that this behavior that Mr. Combs is allegedly displaying is being demonstrated specifically against women. Paragraph 42. Once the ban was made, Mr. Combs' contempt for women was readily apparent, and as he continued to display aggressive and hostile behavior toward Miss Richard and her all-female Danity Kane bandmates. Mr. Combs regularly referred to the 5 women as B's and H's and denigrated their physical appearance. By way of example, Mr. Combs stated that Miss Richard was too skinny and needed to do something about this, her face. So paragraph 43. On one occasion in or around 2005, during the first season of Making the Band 3, Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs' ex-partner and the mother of 3 of his children, Kim Porter, leaving Mr. Combs' recording studio in tears with visible facial injuries, including a lacerated lip. Realizing that Mr. Combs was capable of committing acts of violence against women caused Miss Richard to feel deep apprehension and fear that Mr. Combs could one day physically harm her. So earlier in the complaint, you recall that there were certain statements that would be made upon, information and belief. So this is, I think, based upon information and belief because, while Miss Richard could observe Miss Porter, exiting the recording studio, she doesn't know that if, these injuries that she observed were in fact caused by by Mr. Combs or she doesn't know if these were caused by Mr. Combs. So this is just, her opinion based upon information and belief. She doesn't really have a lot of personal knowledge regarding the cause of these injuries that she believes she observed. So paragraph 44, Miss Richard was present when Mr. Combs was introduced to Cassie for the first time in or around 2006. The moment Mr. Combs first saw Miss Ventura, his demeanor noticeably shifted. Mr. Combs positioned himself directly in front of Miss Ventura's seat, invading her personal space, and fixated on her with an intense, unyielding stare, isolating her from the other people in the room, including Miss Ventura's then boyfriend, music producer Ryan Leslie. So I think this is going back to I think it's going back to these allegations of, this conduct that Mr. Combs is allegedly displaying is really aimed toward women, right? And Miss Richard is observing the beginning, I believe, of this behavior in Mr. Combs' alleged interpersonal relationships with both his Kim Porter and, in this paragraph, Miss Ventura. Paragraph 45, coincidentally, the first meeting between Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura was the first time that Miss Richard was in Mr. Combs' presence without a camera crew filming. Observing Mr. Combs behave in such an intimidating, predatory manner the first time that they were off camera made Miss Richard feel deeply apprehensive and afraid of him. 46. Subsequently, Miss Ventura ended her relationship with Mr. Leslie and began dating Mr. Combs, who would become violent and abusive towards her. So that's obviously based upon information and belief. But, the same token, we've all seen this video of Mr. Combs at the Intercontinental Hotel physically assaulting Miss Ventura. So, we've observed Mr. Combs being violent and physically abusive toward Miss Ventura. Paragraph 3. So sexual harassment, inhumane treatment, and denial of basic needs. So paragraph 47, for the majority of Mrs. Richard's tenure as a member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Mr. Combs required her to remain at his various residences and studios in New York, Los Angeles, Florida, and New Jersey for activities such as recording, rehearsing, dressing, preparing costumes, and exercising. What's interesting about this paragraph is the notation of the locations of these studios. I think this is going to be relevant information when it comes to the causes of action that are alleged against Mr. Combs. They're going to be seeking relief under specific statutes in the cities where these alleged incidents occurred. So obviously, New York, this complaint is being brought in New York, Los Angeles, California. So they might even potentially want to invoke law in Florida, the law in New Jersey, for the claims that they're alleging against Mr. Combs as a result of these factual incidents. So paragraph 48, throughout the productions of Making the Band 3 and 4, Mr. Combs deprived Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates of basic needs such as adequate food and sleep. When Miss Richard or her Danity Kane bandmates requested meals or rest, Mr. Combs refused and chastised them with derogatory comments like, "You bees don't want this," or "Y'all are not hungry enough," and "I'm paying you bees to work." This demeaning behavior gradually undermined Miss Richard's confidence and contributed significantly to her growing feelings of insecurity and fear of reprisal from Mr. Combs. So paragraph 48, let's note that earlier Miss Richard notes that Danity Kane is an all-female group. So when she says that this treatment Mr. Combs allegedly displayed, depriving not only Miss Richard but all of these females in the group, that's going to support her cause of action that this behavior is reserved for women that Mr. Combs works with, allegedly, of course. Also note in paragraph 48, we're looking at the employment aspect of it, right? Miss Richard is alleging that she's an employee. Mr. Combs and these entities that he represents are her employers. So there are certain protections that employees have in regards to meal and rest breaks, right? In terms of how many hours they can work a day, how they're compensated. Now, understandably, the music industry is a bit different, but I believe that she's hinting at these working conditions that were established by Mr. Combs and these other entities fell below, right, what the law requires of them, even in the entertainment industry. Paragraph 49, upon information and belief, Mr. Combs would regularly be awake for prolonged periods of time because he was high on drugs. That appears to just potentially just be a jab, right? He was high. Maybe potentially a shot at his character as a drug user and abuser. But when Mr. Combs made his public apology, he did discuss abusing in the past substances, and that contributing to the state of mind he was in at the time that he physically assaulted Miss Ventura, as was depicted in the video from the Intercontinental. So he himself has admitted past drug use, but this is probably just to further assassinate his character, that he's not only engages in this kind of behavior, but he's also high on drugs. So going back to paragraph 49, during these periods, Mr. Combs demanded continuous access to Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates, often forcing them to record and rehearse for stretches of 36 to 48 hours without breaks. Forced to choose between eating and sleeping, Miss Richard lost a significant amount of weight, weighing approximately 100 pounds at a height of 5'4". Miss Richard begins to normalize these extreme conditions and perceive them as standard requirements of her participation in Danity Kane. So again, let's pick up on the themes that they're trying to highlight in this factual section. We have these inhumane working conditions where they're working for 36 to 48 hours without breaks. As the employer, based in the given state, or even as members, if they're members of I'm sorry, what's the word? Like the actor's version of a union, right? There are certain requirements in terms of meal and rest breaks and how many hours people can work in a day. So highlighting that she was forced to work and rehearse for 36 to 48 hours is getting at whether or not Mr. Combe and these entities were breaking the law as her employers in terms of what was required of her when she was working. Okay, let's move down. Right, paragraph 50 also highlighting these conditions. Um, Over time, a abnormal sleep arrangement came to feel routine, further normalizing Mr. Combs' invasive demands. Paragraph 51. In addition, there's exhausting rehearsals that were required to participate in, working out with a personal trainer. On one occasion, Miss Richard was so dehydrated that she vomited, and instead of getting her medical assistance, this incident was recorded by MTV Network, contributing to her acceptance of such treatment as part of her professional life. So, earlier we talked about whether or not this behavior by Mr. Combs, by the entities that she works for, they're setting the standard of what she believes is how female artists in the music industry are treated. And so in this paragraph 51, she's highlighting that being, sick and vomiting, instead of getting medical assistance, she was recorded, and she attributed this incident to saying this is what's normal in the industry. So when we think, hey, a reasonable person wouldn't endure this treatment and go back, time after time, because this behavior is abnormal. Well, that might be true from, my perspective or your perspective, but from her perspective, this being her experience working in the music industry, she's attributing all these experiences to saying, this is what's accepted. This is how things work in this industry. If I'm going to work in this industry, these are the kinds of things that I'm going to have to endure to be successful. So that's the theme. That's another one of the themes that are kind of being echoed throughout this complaint. The unrelenting and rigorous schedule of rehearsals, performance, and near constant filming that Mr. Combe imposed caused Miss Richard to experience extreme weight loss, dehydration, fatigue, and painful rashes on her back. These conditions intensified Miss Richard's feelings of powerlessness as she increasingly viewed them as part of her professional reality and feared the consequences of any resistance. Right? Echoing the theme, this is why she's continuing to endure this treatment and believes that it's a part of the course for being a female in the entertainment industry. And in this dynamic, she feels like she is powerless to push back. Paragraph 53. In a further assertion of power, here's that theme, and dominance, Mr. Combs insisted on holding meetings while dressed only in his underwear. Alright, so let's think about that. He's her employer. He's calling meetings. He's in his underwear. So we can see the what she's trying to allude to in terms of she's the employee, he's her employer, these are business meetings, and he's in his underwear. When Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs to put clothes on, he refused, saying, "This is my effing house." Mr. Combs then conducted a meeting lasting approximately an hour while dressed in his underwear, causing Miss Richard to feel violated and embarrassed, and amplifying her feelings of powerlessness. Paragraph 54. Following the official breakup of Danity Kane, Miss Richard experienced significant financial hardship. So let's take a pause here. So going back to this idea that, Miss Richard is experiencing all of this treatment, by Mr. Combs, by the MTV filming crew. What would make her stay, right? And what makes a lot of us stay in situations that maybe we should not remain in? The financial hardship, right? So Ms. Richard states, with no prospective opportunities for employment within the entertainment field, Ms. Richard spent several months traveling from Baltimore to New York without pay or an allocated budget. Mr. Combs promised Ms. Richard compositions would result in payment of licensing fees and royalties pursuant to her contract with Bad Boy Records. However, no such compensation was ever reported or paid to Ms. Richard. Damages relative to these continuing copyright infringements will be proven at trial. So earlier when I said, hey, she's claiming that she's been out a certain amount of monies, there might be an issue with the statute of limitations. So this sentence kind of clues us into what her attorney's position is, which is these violations are continuous. So that may be potentially an argument they would advance for why certain rules regarding the statute of limitations would not apply, because these violations are continuing violations. All right, so this is section 4. Diddy Dirty Money. Miss Richard experiences Mr. Combs' gender-based physical violence, criminal acts, SA, threats, and intimidation. By approximately the fall of 2009, many of Miss Richard's compositions had been recorded by other Bad Boy artists. Due to the success of her compositions, Miss Richard was invited to meet with musical artist Kalina Harper, Miss Harper, and shortly thereafter, Mr. Combs, Miss Richard, and Miss Harper formed a new group, Diddy Dirty Money. So let's just keeping track of the timeline. Danity Kane ends in 2009. Miss Richard is experiencing some financial hardships. She figures that she has no other prospects of employment within the entertainment industry, and up comes this opportunity to be a part of Diddy Dirty Money with Diddy, with the opportunity for her to continue to use her gifts in terms of composition to be in this new group. So the recording of their album Last Train to Paris took place in Mr. Combs' home in Los Angeles. It's probably significant in terms of trying to frame, okay, what law might apply to things that are happening related to the recording of this album Last Train to Paris. Probably why we have a mention of California. On the first day of recording, Miss Richard and Miss Harper arrived at Mr. Combs' home and waited in the kitchen where Mr. Combs' girlfriend, Miss Ventura, was frying eggs for him. Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs come down the stairs looking high on drugs, enter the kitchen, approach Miss Ventura and scream, "I've been asking you for my blank. I can't stand you, B. You never do it right." Mr. Combs pushed Miss Ventura against the wall, choked her, then picked up a scalding hot pan of eggs and threw it at Miss Ventura, causing her to fall to the ground in a fetal position. Cursing and screaming, Mr. Combs dragged Miss Ventura up the stairs. Frozen in shock and terror, Miss Richard heard glass shattering, crashing, and banging noises as Mr. Combs dragged Miss Ventura up the stairs. Miss Richard wanted to intervene and help Miss Ventura, but Miss Harper was adamantly refused to interfere in Mr. Combs' relationship and physically led Miss Richard out of the residence. Terrified and shaken, Miss Richard returned to her hotel where she was unable to sleep due to worrying about Miss Ventura and her own safety. The following day, Miss Richard received a call demanding that she return to Mr. Combs' residence to continue recording. Mr. Combs brought Miss Richard and Miss Harper into the recording room at his studio, locked the door, dimmed the lights, and gave each of them flowers. I'm going to pause for a second. Let's note, as I stated before, Miss Richard has highlighted this employment relationship between her, Mr. Combs, and the entities that they work for and with. So Miss Richard is appearing at his residence to conduct business. She observes a domestic dispute. She is then summoned to come back. And I think this is implied, but this is what, I'm inferring from what's here. She felt like she could not say no, despite the night before worrying about her own safety based upon what she observed during the domestic dispute. Now, when she arrives back at the Combs residence, locking the door, dimming the lights, right? That's suggesting that they aren't free to leave. So I think that this may be an instance of what they were saying about being kidnapped or detained by Mr. Combs. So let's pick up. Mr. Combs went on at length stating this is normal. This was a lover's argument where no one was hurt. This is what love is. I'm giving you an opportunity. If you want to make it, you'll shut your mouth. If you say anything, there will be consequences. Mr. Combs further warned that people end up missing. Being threatened while locked for over 20 minutes in a small enclosed space with Mr. Combs after observing Mr. Combs violently assault Miss Ventura the day before, Miss Richard was terrified and genuinely believed that Mr. Combs would follow through on his threats. In or around November 2009, after the Soul Train Awards, Mr. Combs flew Miss Richard and Miss Harper to his home in New York on his private jet for an after party, noting that there were copious amounts of illicit drugs being consumed openly. On information and belief, Mr. Combs had arranged for dozens of young women and girls, some of whom appeared to be underage, to be transported to the party. Okay, so let's note a few things in this paragraph. Now, we know that there have been prior allegations about whether or not Homeland Security conducting a raid of Diddy's homes was connected to allegations that he was involved in moving women back and forth. So here we have this allegation that Mr. Combs himself arranged dozens of women and girls to be transported to the party, right? So this kind of is getting at that speculation of Homeland Security being called in because of rumors that Mr. Combs is involved with the transportation of women and girls. The women arrived wearing little to no clothing and were given drugs and alcohol. That could potentially be problematic if they're asserting that some of these people were underage. Serving them underage people alcohol, that could create a problem. Many of them appeared lethargic or passed out, while Mr. Combs and his guests performed sexual acts on them. Miss Richard believed that her presence at the party was a test to see whether Mr. Combs could trust her. Okay, let's keep moving forward. Mr. Combs repeatedly said things like, "This is a buffet. Enjoy yourselves. This is what we do. This is how we party." Miss Richard felt shocked and horrified at the sight of Mr. Combs and his guests violating incapacitated young women and implored Mr. Combs' personal assistant, Capricorn Clark, to allow her to leave. Miss Clark insisted that Miss Richard wait 15 minutes for Mrs. Clark to make it make sense. That is, to make Miss Richard's exit less conspicuous so that Mr. Combs would not notice that she had left. Knowing that she was not free to leave and had to wait for Miss Clark to help her orchestrate her departure, Miss Richard experienced feelings of panic and being trapped against her will. So here we have the themes of kidnapping, right? And Miss Richard feeling like her employment is tied to her appearance at this party, um, where she's observing things that are make her feel very uncomfortable. Um, Paragraph 62. Mr. Combs regularly placed Miss Richard in similar situations with no means to escape. At Mr. Combs' drug-fueled parties, we're no longer on information and belief, we're just calling them drug-fueled parties, okay. His guests, including Miss Richard, were required to surrender their phones upon entry. Mr. Combs kept the doors locked and guarded by security personnel, making it impossible for Miss Richard to leave without alerting Mr. Combs that she had done so. Mr. Combs hired police officers to attend his parties, sending a clear message to guests that his influence extended to law enforcement officers and creating a climate of fear and tacit warning that reporting him to authorities would be both unacceptable and futile. All right. So these paragraphs are getting to people's comments that, well, if it was so bad, she wouldn't go back. Well, here we have an explanation. Miss Richard is feeling powerless in the situation, and she believes that, law enforcement is on his side, right? Creating this climate of fear and warning that no one's going to believe you. Everyone's on his side. On many occasions, Mr. Combs had parties at his Miami, Florida residence that lasted for several days. At one of the parties, Miss Richard witnessed Mr. Combs openly stating that he had arranged for busloads of young exotic girls such as mixed black and Asian, Indonesian, and albino. Once again, Miss Richard observed inebriated young girls being sexually violated by Mr. Combs and his guests. In a state of panic and terror, Miss Richard fled to the bedroom Mr. Combs had insisted she stay in and barricaded the door shut with furniture. Mr. Combs openly assaulted Miss Ventura in front of Miss Richard and other witnesses on multiple occasions. On one occasion, in or around the fall of 2009, Dirty Money was in New York preparing to perform at a festival. Inside the vehicle, Mr. Combs grabbed Miss Ventura's neck, pulled her out of the van onto the grass, and pinned her head down, choking her while yelling, "You're gonna get effed up today." This incident took place in the backstage area just outside the festival and was entirely visible to passerby. Wow. Okay, so this is saying that he was so upset that he wasn't even hiding what he was doing. Anyone could have observed what was going on. In another instance, in or around early 2010, Mr. Combs punched Miss Ventura in the face in the bathroom of a party in Los Angeles. Frequently, when Miss Ventura attempted to voice an opinion or stand up to Mr. Combs, he would strike her or wrap his hands around her throat and choke her. On the first several occasions that they observed Mr. Combs assault Miss Ventura, Miss Richard and Miss Harper spoke with Miss Ventura to support and encourage Miss Ventura in escaping her abusive relationship with Mr. Combs. Every time that Miss Richard and Miss Harper tried to intervene, Mr. Combs learned of the conversation and became irate. Mr. Combs screamed at the women, "Y'all bees, don't get in my relationship. Don't tell my bee what she needs to be doing. Just make money and shut the F up. I end artists. I shelve careers. You could be missing. And you bees want to be unalive today." Among other threats. Alright, so next paragraph. Interscope enabled Mr. Combs' gender-motivated violence. Okay. In or around late 2009 or early 2010, Bad Boy entered into an agreement with Interscope. Upon information and belief, Bad Boy was paid $50 million in exchange for Bad Boy's future releases being distributed through Interscope. In doing so, Mr. Combs intended to capitalize on Interscope's significant resources and enhanced the promotion and sales of Bad Boy releases, including the Dirty Money album. In the weeks and months leading up to the Bad Boy Interscope deal, Mr. Combs had frequent meetings with producer and then CEO of Interscope, Jimmy Iovine. On one such occasion, Combs hosted a dinner at a West Hollywood, California restaurant, which Miss Richard and Miss Harper were required to attend. Okay, this is getting back to the employment aspect of it. Their attendance at this event is tied to their employment. Also, you recall earlier when we were looking at the parties, when it looked specifically at Interscope, there was a suggestion that they enabled the behavior of Mr. Combs and profited from it. So I think we're going to get to some allegations that are supposed to support this claim. Among guests at the dinner were celebrities like Neo, Usher, as well as Mr. Iovine. At the dinner, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura had an argument. In front of the dinner guests, Mr. Combs hissed at Miss Ventura in a screaming whisper and forcefully punched her in the stomach, causing her to double over in visible pain, crying. Mrs. Clark escorted Miss Ventura out of the restaurant, and Mr. Combs remained and continued socializing with dinner guests. At this point, Interscope Records clearly had actual knowledge that Combs was dangerous around females and that Combs was willing to brazenly batter a female in public. Even after Mr. Iovine watched Mr. Combs commit a violent assault in front of numerous high-profile witnesses, the Bad Boy Interscope deal took place and remains in effect, providing Mr. Combs with immense financial rewards and enabling him to commit further acts of violence without fear of repercussions. Watching Mr. Combs openly assault Miss Ventura in front of Mr. Iovine and various celebrities, and observing that other powerful music industry representatives were complicit in Mr. Combs' behavior, amplified Mrs. Richard's fears that Mr. Combs could one day harm her and his actions would be accepted and normalized by everyone around him. Okay. Alright, so this next paragraph. Diddy Dirty Money. Mr. Combs subjects Miss Richard to labor trafficking and oppressive work conditions. So in or around fall of 2009, they began reporting Love Comes Down. Mr. Combs continued to use drugs. Alright. Mr. Combs required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to remain at his homes, continuously denying the opportunity to return to their hotel rooms for breaks. The degree of control Mr. Combs exercised over Mrs. Richard's daily life and basic needs exacerbated the significant power imbalance and threatening atmosphere that ensured Miss Richard's compliance with his demands. So going back to this employer-employee relationship, he's setting these requirements. He's setting these expectations that she has to work for long periods of times without breaks, without meals. She believes or she expects this is how a female in this industry must be treated. He's not treating her differently than he treated her fellow bandmates when she was in Danity Kane, and her and Miss Harper, both female, are being treated the same when it comes to them recording this Diddy Dirty Money album. Okay, paragraph 72. Occasionally, Miss Richard would attempt to leave to get something to eat or go to her hotel room. Whenever Miss Richard attempted to leave, Mr. Combs would call and demand, "Where the F are you? We have an album to make." He would make threats, especially when asked for food or rest, stating, "You're a B. I don't want to see you. I don't want to see your effing face. I make ninjas go missing, and I make things go away." Every time Miss Richard returned to the studio immediately, believing that Mr. Combs was capable of following through with his threats. Mr. Combs had full meals prepared by a chef and ate them in front of Miss Richard and Miss Harper, never offering them food. Again, here's a treatment directed toward women. He's treating both women in this scenario the same, allegedly, both Miss Richard and Miss Harper. They begged for food and rest breaks, but he refused, making statements such as, "Absolutely effing not. This is what it takes to be great." So as a result of this nonstop working, Miss Richard became dehydrated, undernourished, excessively thin. And when she told him that she wasn't feeling well, he called her dead lazy and dismissed her health concerns. Okay, so 2010, she was diagnosed with arthralgia. Don't know how to say that. Joint pain due to overuse and a low white blood cell count. When she presented her medical records saying that she needed to eat, be well hydrated, get rest, he ordered her to report to the studio the next day for another multi-day recording session, blatantly disregarding her health, and she feared of his authority and control over her career. So again, thinking about him being her employer and her presenting documentation saying, hey, the doctor says I need to have meals, I need to have rest, I need to have breaks, and his response is, be back here tomorrow. So this is just underscoring, in terms of the employer dynamic, how she's seeking accommodations, how she's asking for certain things that she likely is entitled to under the law, and him as her employer denying these requests. She also notes that she continued to see the abuse of Mr. Combs toward Miss Ventura. Mr. Combs often exhibited an uncontrollable anger during recording sessions, throwing objects. Mr. Combs frequently flew into frenzied, unpredictable rages, making Miss Richard fear that any missteps could direct his anger toward her. But her fear went beyond physical safety because she had witnessed Mr. Combs' violent nature, a side of him that the world had not yet seen. She feared that falling out of his good graces, standing up to him, or speaking out against him could result in serious harm to her. Miss Richard frequently thought about his threats that he makes people go missing and feared taking any action that could label her as a target. So despite all of this, the Dirty Money album was successful, selling 2 million copies of one single, 5 million single copies, and she estimates unpaid wages and royalties about $1.2 million, unpaid touring of $350,000. All right, so then it's about Ciroc, Diddy beats and non-payment. So more factual allegations specifically about the employment relationship. Never compensated for time spent, for promotional contracts for Ciroc in the Diddy Beats campaign. He was paid $250,000 per appearance. He did not compensate Miss Richard or Miss Harper for these appearances, other than an occasional $5,000. Right, highlighting he has disparate treatment of women, or he treats women differently, and he's treating Miss Richard and Miss Harper the same. He's not paying either of them. He's occasionally giving each of them $5,000. He said that his withholding of compensations that they were required for their tour. Again, going back to this employer-employee relationship, he's making these excuses about compensation, etc., and her as the employee believing that she had to comply with what he's saying because he's her employer. Over time, he was paid $6.25 million for shows that Miss Richard was required to attend. She questioned him about these sporadic payments and he responded that you bees are ungrateful, you don't want this. She estimates that she's lost approximately $1,562,500 as a result of these promotions. She also says that she didn't get compensated for Diddy beats. Next session, Mr. Combs harasses and SAs Miss Richard. Between approximately 2009 and 2011, during the process of recording the Dirty Money album, Mr. Combs frequently referred to Miss Richard as a B or an H and made demeaning remarks about her body, calling her lazy, fat, ugly, and skinny in front of his friends, producers, and bodyguards. He frequently held meetings wearing only his underwear despite her protests, and in response called her B's and H's and reminded her that she should be grateful for her opportunity to be there. When recording in the studio, he would have parties. He would invite young women and men, scantily dressed, appearing to be underage, who use drugs and engage in acts. Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs and his colleagues kiss, grope, and inappropriately touch young women. Upon information and beliefs, the participants often left the immediate area to engage in acts and returned shortly thereafter. Mr. Combs is alleged to have intruded in Mrs. Richard's changing room unannounced while she was undressed. Even though a female stylist was present and assisting Miss Richard, Mr. Combs would grope Miss Richard's body, including her bare buttocks and her chest area near her breast, with no legitimate purpose and without Miss Richard's consent. He would caress Miss Richard's buttocks to show the stylist where he wanted her high-waisted panties positioned, and attempted to touch her breast, claiming to show the stylist where he wanted her bra straps to go. When Mr. Combs would enter the changing room, Miss Richard would cover her chest with her hands to prevent Mr. Combs from seeing or touching her breast. When Mr. Combs would touch her body, she would attempt to swat his hands away and say, "Don't touch me." Mr. Combs frequently smacked Miss Richard's bare buttocks and often commented on her body, noting that although she was skinny, she still had a butt. Ignoring her visible and communicated discomfort, Mr. Combs persisted and continued to intrude when Miss Richard was in her dressing room, continued to touch her buttocks and breast area under the guise of showing the stylist what to do, and continued to smack her buttocks without her consent. Paragraph 91. Another example of Mr. Combs smacking Miss Richard's buttocks, making the comment, "You're looking good, okay, Don, okay, and I see what that is," in a flirtatious tone. Each time Miss Richard moved away and asked him not to touch her, but Mr. Combs disregarded her protest. On their last night in Glasgow, Miss Richard witnessed Mr. Combs and several other males banging Mr. Combs' female assistant at the hotel pool. Miss Richard immediately left and went to her hotel room. On the flight back to the United States the next day, Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs where his assistant was. Mr. Combs replied, "I don't give an F where that B is." Miss Richard later learned that Mr. Combs had taken his assistant's passport with him, leaving the assistant stranded in the UK. In Glasgow, Miss Harper confided in Miss Richard that her husband and manager was abusive. After an especially severe assault, she confided in Miss Richard that she wanted to leave Mr. Vick, and Miss Richard helped her to plan her exit from the relationship. However, Miss Harper and Mr. Vick reconciled, and both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick learned of Miss Richard's role in helping Miss Harper. Both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick became noticeably distrustful of Miss Richard, which exacerbated her fears of harm and reprisal. Mr. Combs would require his bandmates to stay in his Miami residence. Miss Rashard would barricade herself in the room at night, placing heavy furniture against the door because she feared being harmed in her sleep. In 2010, Miss Rashard, Miss Harper, and Miss Ventura were in Mr. Combs' residence when Mr. Combs stated, "I want to give you fake breasts for Christmas." Mr. Combs reached out and cupped Miss Rashard's breast without her permission and stated, "You're an A, I'm thinking a D." Miss Rashard recoiled in shock and left the room. Throughout the above-mentioned time period when Miss Rashard resisted Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs retaliated by denying her singing parts in songs, removing her from songs, refusing to allow her to sing in performances, and turning her mic off during performances. The more Miss Rashard rebuffed his advances, the more retaliatory Mr. Combs' behavior increased. So, going back to he's her employer, she's alleging a direct correlation between her rebuffing his advances and her opportunities at work. She's using the terms retaliation, right? Those are words that are often used in the employment law context when, a person makes a complaint or takes a certain action, and in response, the employer takes adverse action that's not based upon the merits or based upon someone's performance, but based upon them filing a complaint, etc. So, next session, Mr. Combs assaults and falsely imprisons Miss Rashard. In December 2010, while preparing for a performance, rehearsals lasted for days without the opportunity to eat or rest, and the rehearsal schedule was unpredictable. Miss Rashard received a phone call from Mr. Combs demanding, "Where the F are you Bs? You Bs don't want this. Y'all don't deserve to have someone pick you up. Get a cab." Miss Rashard and Miss Harper took a cab to the studio in New York, anxious because Mr. Combs sounded enraged. Upon their arrival, Mr. Combs and Harpier were waiting for them in the lobby. Mr. Combs screamed obscenities at them. "Where the F were you Bs? You Bs don't want to win. You don't want this. I'm so tired of y'all." Miss Rashard noticed that people in the lobby were reacting to Mr. Combs' tirade. Embarrassed, Miss Rashard asked Mr. Combs to stop swearing and calling them Bs in front of everyone. Mr. Combs' facial expression shifted, and he stepped toward Miss Rashard, raised his arm, and swung his fist toward her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit her, Miss Rashard braced for the impact. But before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs' bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio, and forced her into the Bentley that was parked outside. Miss Harper ran after Miss Rashard, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley doors with both women inside. Again, treatment directed toward both of the women, even though Miss Rashard was the one who was allegedly the victim of potentially being struck by Mr. Combs. Both women were subject to him expressing his dismay and, hurling insults at them. So now they're both locked into this vehicle. Inside the vehicle, there were no interior door handles, and they were locked inside with no way to escape. Miss Rashard's belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Miss Harper's phone. Miss Rashard relayed to her father what had happened, that she needed help and feared she would go missing. Moments later, Mr. Combs' bodyguard removed only Miss Harper from the vehicle, leaving Miss Rashard locked in the car alone for over 2 hours. Miss Rashard screamed as loudly as she could, but no one responded. It was late evening in the wintertime. The windows were heavily tinted, and the car was dark except for faint interior lights. Miss Rashard's belongings and winter coat were in the studio, while the ignition was off and there was no heat. With Mr. Combs' prior threats of violence in her mind, Miss Rashard felt sheer panic, terror, and feelings of claustrophobia at being locked in a small, dark, enclosed space with no way to communicate or call for help. She began to feel cold and fear for her life, not knowing when or if she would be released. Miss Rashard's father drove to New York from Baltimore and arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Miss Richard from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Miss Richard's father between several rooms at the studio, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Miss Richard's father expressed that he intended to contact the police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs' threats and actions, which in turn made Miss Richard feel terrified for herself and her family's safety. The next day, they performed on SNL, and Mr. Combs called Miss Richard, complimented her performance, and concluded with the threat, "You don't call your dad unless you're in a hospital." Alright, so moving on, we have more allegations about the breach of contract, the copyright infringement as a result of royalties and other unpaid items in relation to Mrs. Richard's performance, both as a member of Danity Kane, as a member of Dirty Money. So she just kind of outlines all the works. She also talks about in 2020, Mr. Combs selected her for a reboot of Making the Band. She spent hours preparing to be a judge, but because of the pandemic, the plans were halted and she was never compensated. She talks about the administrative rights for songs. There's itemized list, and she alleges defendants have wholly failed to account or pay Miss Richard as agreed for her compositions and her performances in a breach of the assignment, and thereby infringe her copyrights, resulting in defendants being unjustly enriched. During the summer of 2023, Mr. Combs' new company, Love Records, tendered a contract for negotiation to Miss Richard for the song entitled "Deliver Me." Upon information and belief, "Deliver Me" sold well prior to Mr. Combs' legal troubles in November 2023. Miss Richard sought her rightful percentage as the composer of the song. Mr. Combs personally called Miss Richard and left a voicemail complaining about her fair request. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs directed his attorneys to avoid confirming the compensation percentages on the songs, and in fact listed composers who played no part in composing the song. As a result, the contract was never signed by either Miss Richard or Love Records. Nevertheless, Miss Richard obtained a copyright registration certificate on a timely basis. Said registration lists authors' claimants as agreed when the songs were created in 2009. That registration is separately filed in the court and supports Miss Richard's claim of copyright infringement. Alright, so that's the end of the factual allegations. We will turn to the